Hello, nonprofit leaders. I'm Sarah Olivieri, your host, and this podcast is here to assist people like you, executive directors, board members, and other nonprofit leaders make a bigger impact with insights, tips, and lessons learned from nonprofit leaders and experts. Having been an executive director, a board member, and now a consultant and coach, I truly understand the challenges you face. And that's why I'm here. I'm all about working smarter, not harder, so you can make a bigger impact without the burnout. And so is our sponsor, DonorBox. DonorBox isn't just a suite of helpful fundraising tools, it's a partner that helps you raise more money and supports you in retaining your donors. I love their forward-thinking approach. Visit donorbox.org to learn more. And don't forget to sign up for the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter, where you'll get bite-sized, actionable tips just for nonprofit leaders like you, delivered weekly to your inbox. Sign up at inspirednonprofitleadership.com/sign up. Okay, let's dive into today's episode. My guest for this episode is Elyse Cherry, who is the CEO of BlueHub Capital, where she has led the organization since 1997. Under her leadership, BlueHub has invested more than $3.2 billion to support affordable housing, health centers, schools, clean energy, foreclosure prevention, and community wealth building initiatives nationwide. She is also the president of Managed Assets at Boston Community Venture Fund, Aura Mortgage Advisors, and NSP Residential. She's a former partner at WilmerHale. Elyse is an attorney with deep experience in real estate finance and community development. She's an active civic leader serving on the boards of several organizations and has been widely recognized for her leadership, including honors from the White House, the Boston Business Journal, and the Financial Times. Welcome, Elyse. It's such a pleasure to have you. Before we dive into things nonprofit leadership, would you just tell us a little bit about yourself personally?
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Sarah. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and with your audience and also your long-term focus on this important topic. In terms of personal things, I guess one thing I would say is I have been a lifelong traveler, particularly in the developing world. It always seems to me that we come back with much more perspective on our day-to-day lives when we recognize how different they can be from the way that other people live around the world.
Oh, that is so true. In my younger years, my college years, I did a lot of study abroad. And in fact, my undergraduate degree was in international studies. And I really found that you discover parts of yourself that are the same throughout the world and your connections with humans all over the place, and really dispels some of those myths of, especially in the quote developing world, or all the problematic names of that it's called. What are some of the countries that you've been to?
Oh, I've traveled to a number of countries in Africa and Asia. And one of the things I have always done really and been so impressed by is almost universal kindness. It is the case, of course, that you can get into difficulty somewhere, but in so many circumstances, people who you've never met before reach out a hand, explain how to do something, try to make your path easier. And I think one of the universal things for all of us, and we do that here at home too, when people come in from other countries, we want them to feel comfortable. And that's just been a terrific experience, which sometimes is not what gets reported day to day. And so I think it's really, really important to have those immediate experiences with everyday people, and remind ourselves that we really are all one.
That's absolutely been my experience. Incredible generosity and kindness. And, I think you're so right. Like seeing that firsthand, because what reaches the news, like the horrible things.
Right. That's what gets right. That's what gets reported. It doesn't get reported when someone goes out of their way to say, this is the bus stop and here's where you have to go. And this is how much you should pay when you get there. And people have done that all over the place.
Absolutely. So Well, let's talk about nonprofit leadership because we
Sure.
could go on that direction all the time. So tell me, you've been running this organization for a long time, and you've grown it from kind of a local regional organization to a national organization. I'd love to hear a little bit about like what are the key lessons you've learned in that journey.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, as you probably know, I helped found this organization back in 1985 when I was a young associate at my law firm. We have really been very consistent since that moment. We set out a bunch of values up front, and we continue to hold to those values. Our mission, which is to help build healthy communities where low income people live and work, has not changed in 40 years. The way we pursue the mission has changed, but the core mission has not changed. And one of the values that I think about a lot, because it's still as relevant today as it was then, is that effective organizations evolve to meet the changing needs of their communities. And I think that's just critical that when we started, we were local, we were in Boston's neighborhoods. It was before the Great Recession. We were really trying to deal with what we then described as gentrification, meaning that people with less wealth were being pushed out of their neighborhoods. As time has gone on, we've really come to understand our mission, same mission, but the pursuit of that mission is much more about building healthy communities. And healthy communities, of course, are about much more than housing. They're about housing and school and culture and food and safety and really trying to create neighborhoods in which people want to be there. They don't feel like they've been warehoused there, but they are there as a choice. And I think one of the other things we've discovered over time, we spend a lot of effort trying to be sure that we're standing at the intersections of communities. And that in a sense is also the way I live my life. I don't want to be ghettoized into a particular community. So we talk a lot about being at the intersection of downtown and community. And what we mean by that often is downtown expertise and community values. So if I'm living in a community, I know a whole lot of things. I might not know how to create a capital stack, right? That might come from downtown. But I sure as heck don't want somebody from downtown saying, because I know that, you don't get to participate. And so really trying to understand the value that everybody on all sides of a transaction brings, I think is critical to doing good development that actually works for communities and for the people who live there.
So I'm hearing like you've really kept true to your mission. It sounds like you started out with a pretty clear mission to begin with. So
Yes.
it sounds like that laid a good foundation. And tell me more about what it's looked like to kind of stick to a set of core values and reinterpret those year after year, like how your actions align with
Sure.
those values.
Well, it really is core to culture. I have often said that the CEO has to be culture czar. I mean, there are lots of things CEOs do. We drive strategy and we figure out the future and we try to make sure the present is stable. But culture, in some respects, is the most important thing. And if the CEO doesn't drive it, it tends to go off in all kinds of directions. And so keeping people focused on, are we being true to mission? Can we accomplish what we set out to do in a way that's sustainable over time? And is it consistent with the values we've established? It continues 40 years in to be a whole lot of the conversation with me. So, for example, we've set up an entity that we call 1% for America. And the goal of this entity is to try and drive down the cost of citizenship, particularly for people who might have a difficult time affording it. And as we've gone through that, really every single day we ask the question, is what we're doing here consistent with who we are as an organization and consistent with mission? Well, we know that's an entity that does not today support itself, but over time it's got to have a plan to support itself or it's really not sustainable. So the notion of being sustainable over time, of meeting people where they are, of assuring that what we do is consistent with what our various constituencies need, those are questions that come up at every single meeting we have. And the other thing I guess I would say is we are at core an intermediary. We're not a direct service provider. And so we have to stand at the intersection between really the financial system and communities as well. And so we have lots and lots of relationships with large money center banks and regional banks and local banks. And individuals who invest in us, the foundations who invest in us. Well, we have to be sure that we're meeting their needs too, or they will stop investing in us, and then there are no funds to lend out. And so it's this very interesting process of really having to look all around the table before you make a decision and trying to figure out whether the decision you're making works for everybody.
Yeah. I have two lines of questions related to that. So the first one is like just nitty-gritty. What does it look like to keep having that conversation? Is it like a question about it baked into meeting agendas? Is it that everyone's so used to asking the question that it always comes up? Does it look like, quarterly planning, annual planning? What does that look like on the ground for the folks out there who are actually, because, they're folks like you, they're asking, well, how do I actually implement that?
Sure. Well, in some ways, it's all of the above. One of the things that I try hard to do is not fill up my week with meetings. I think that one of the great risks for a CEO is everybody wants a meeting, and maybe they're productive and maybe they're not productive. And by the time you get to the end of the week, you haven't had any time to think your way through upcoming issues or to really sit back and reflect on where things are. So managing time is really, really, really critical. And so from that perspective, we're a little bit more ad hoc about this. So somebody comes up with an idea or we're talking about something, and then the question is, well, wait a minute, how does this comport to mission? Is it consistent with mission? We also take very seriously, like I always quote Sister Lillian, who used to lead Mercy Housing, and she had a 9 by 11, 9 by 11 piece of paper on her wall that said, no money, no mission. And we quote that all the time because if you can't make the thing pencil, in the end, you can't do it. And so the questions really are about, for example, with our loan fund, what does risk look like, particularly in a world that's dramatically changing on the federal side? What do our communities need, with subsidy necessarily not being the same as it's always been? What is it that people want? Are we changing, and do we have the right partners and the right money sources in order to meet those needs? So those questions are really all core to what we do. And I think one of the hardest things is we're all humans, right? And humans tend to march. And sometimes if you don't pay attention, you can march right off the cliff and not notice. And so this idea of really trying to stop at every juncture and saying, is this still the right route, right? It's not a long process. We don't have to have we do have a strategic planning process, and we do have retreats every year. But the real issue is not the annual. The real issue is, how do we be sure it's baked into our day-to-day thinking about things? And a lot of that is about modeling. I try hard to model that behavior. My senior team models that behavior. And as a result, it really gets into people's DNA and into the organization's DNA.
Yeah, I love that. And for everyone listening, like just rewind for a moment and listen again to all those questions Elyse just listed. I often think of, great leadership is about asking better questions, not necessarily knowing better answers. Like if you can ask a better question. And what I heard you just model that I often do in my coaching and I'm teaching leaders is when somebody comes to you with a question, the first thing to ask yourself, is that the right question? Right. And so often we're tempted to just jump to answer whatever question is put before us. But what I heard you just do is step back and you have a whole list of potential questions in your head that you might be considering. What is the question here, right? And it sounds like one of those common questions when someone comes and asks you a question is this mission aligned? Is this values aligned? So I think that's like really, really gold stuff right there. And I'm always collecting good questions. So you just listed off some great ones. Along those same lines, I want to ask you, because you brought up the importance of your community partners. How do you like keep those partnerships aligned? And do you have any lessons about partnerships that weren't aligned that you wish you hadn't done, or things that you ended up avoiding? Like, what are those keys that signal this partnership may not be aligned? Because I think, especially when there's like potential for that revenue that is part of our lifeblood, there's a temptation sometimes to go for partnerships that maybe aren't fully aligned. I bet you have some rich experience in there.
What an interesting question. And by the way, I 100% agree with you that the root of good leadership is asking the right questions, much more so than providing answers. So, as I noted earlier, we are an intermediary. And what that means is we have relationships around the circle across the board. And, which some folks might say, well, why are you having relationships with big money center banks? And doesn't that influence what you do? And what I would say about that is one of the things that we've tried very hard to do over the years is to be sure that we are not dependent on any sole or significant source of finance. That what I really want is an entire basket of relationships so that we maintain our independence. And because we do that, we generally have very good conversations with the various institutions and organizations that help us in terms of supplying the debt capital and also the equity capital to move forward. I think maintaining independence as an organization gives tremendous flexibility to the work that we do and to the decisions that we make. We have not come to a point where we really had to say to someone, or at least not in my mind right now, no, we're going to walk away from this. But we certainly have had experiences where we came close to that and, really had to figure out how to work with whatever the entity was in a way that was both consistent with mission and worked for our organization and for our communities. I remember an early one with a very large national foundation that had a very different view than we did. And we had a long, long set of conversations and figured out, how to get to a place where each of us had what we needed. And I think that negotiation, when you're dealing with particularly large and powerful financial partners, either in the private sector or the philanthropic sector or the public sector, frankly, is really important. I'll give you another example. We have financed our Sun initiative, which is the way that we keep people who are losing their homes to foreclosure in their homes, originally with individual private capital because we couldn't get anybody to lend to us. They kept saying, wait a minute, you want to lend money to people who are in default and foreclosure who are generally not wealthy people? And I would say, yes. And they'd say, if anyone's dumb enough to lend you that money, right, it's like 12 or 15%. And I would say, I went to law school, not business school. I never learned how to borrow at 15 and lend at 6. And so, we'd be back and forth about all that. And we finally got a lender to work with us. And then once we'd proven the model, we went down to the CDFI fund. And the initial answer was just give us, access to all of your assets throughout the organization, and we're happy to fund you. And we said, no, we can't do that. We have all of these other relationships. We can't put people in second position. We can't do that. It took us 4 years in order to really persuade people that the loans themselves and the overages and so forth were sufficient. And so, but you have to understand what's important to you. And then you have to stick to your guns, right? Not in an adversarial way, not in a hostile way, but really in a way that explains why it is that you are doing what you're doing. And, having some success over time is also very helpful in terms of creating credibility.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, like I'm hearing going back to like if you're really sticking to a clear mission and a set of clear values and ways of doing things, you have that strong culture, you probably also like it makes it easier to hold your ground, stick to your guns, and you're probably like just emitting that culture out into the world and actively repelling the bad fits so they don't even come to your door and have to waste your time. And I'm hearing, yeah.
That may be true. I mean, for me, trying to lead a values-driven life is also really important. So the whole thing is really a consistent worldview. And we have had people come and propose things that have just said, no, we're not going to do that, right? And it doesn't help our communities. It doesn't help us. And sometimes what I say is, we don't want to be the stupid money, right? So we really need to, and there's lots of opportunity to be there. So we really we do say no to things with a lot, but with some regularity. If new programs come through and we just think this really doesn't make any sense for our communities or it doesn't make any sense for us, then we don't do it. And you have to be willing to do that and have enough faith in your own culture and your organization and your team and your own judgment about things.
Yeah, I totally agree about that. And, if you're not saying no to some opportunities, you probably are getting swayed all over. I want to ask you because so many organizations, nonprofits are thinking about systems change and this intersection of community and and have recognized that it is such an important place to be, and yet it can be overwhelming because there's so many pieces that sometimes it can be hard to take action or feel like it's hard to run experiments because there's so many ways you could go. What are some practices or tips that you have for people in thinking about at what when to try things, what size to try things, unintended consequences, how to deal with them, like that mess that is being at the intersection of real community systems change.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing I would say is nobody always gets it right. And so one of the things, sure. I mean, it's impossible to kind of lay out a path and then march down that path and it always works. It just doesn't. Startups in the private sector almost inevitably need to pivot. And that's true also for programs and new initiatives and so forth in the philanthropic sector. And so, really keeping track and trying to figure out what's working and what isn't working is critical. Like, I'll give you an example. With respect to 1% for America, we realized we needed more controls in place, that our default rate was too high. And so we really had to stop and take apart our systems and look at things and try and figure out ways in which we could still create a product that was useful and valuable for people, but nonetheless had enough safety features built in that we could continue it over time. When it comes to the broadest systems issues in terms of policy, federal policy, and state policy, it's a really good question, and the answer to it changes a lot over time. So, for example, back in the late 80s, early 90s, we did a lot of work with other community development financial institutions in a field that was just emerging to begin to put together the legislation that authorized the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund. And so that was a place where we really felt like we had a national lever that we could pull. And it's been enormously helpful over time in terms of both spreading the idea of what we call CDFIs across the country and also creating a vehicle now managed through Treasury, really, but an independent vehicle that could also provide support for smaller organizations growing and tax credits and so forth. So sometimes you really can figure out a national lever and join with all of your sister organizations and give it one heck of a pull. Other times that's not possible. Sometimes there are state legislative things that you can manage. For example, we right now have a bill before the state legislature with respect to shared housing. And what we're looking at is, in Massachusetts at least, we have a ton of people who come here to go to school, but it's so expensive to stay here that they leave. And we don't want them to leave. We need them to build the economy. We also have a ton of older folks, just as one use case, who are living in big houses. They're empty nesters. They don't really want to leave the home, but they can't quite stay either. And so we're trying to figure out, can we deal with legal issues that make it hard to combine those two groups? Do we need relief housing? Do we need some difference in the way houses are insured so that the insurer doesn't say, wait a minute, I didn't think you were running a boarding house, or whatever they might say, right? Can we create a circumstance in which people can vet each other? Can we do all of that in a way that doesn't interfere with the important tenancy rights that people have when they're actual tenants as opposed to home shares? And so we're proceeding through the legislature on that. And if we can get that done, we think it could free up as many as 50,000 units in Massachusetts and also then be a real example for the country going forward. And the thing about freeing up space or freeing up tenant space is it also starts to take pressure off the rental market, which should help in terms of reducing the increases in rent that everybody is struggling with. So those are two examples. And then a lot of it is really about paying attention to our communities. One of the things that we have done for a long time is to encourage everybody in the organization to engage in civic leadership. So rather than joining the board of a nonprofit and then kind of covering because really it's during the workday and should you really be doing it, we encourage everybody and tell them to tell us about it. We'll mentor people through it. I do a lot of that. And so what that does is, in addition to providing or provides expertise, I hope, to the nonprofits and to the public sector, but it also is a tremendous learning experience for our staff. And it's a way for us to have a whole different ear to the ground. And so somebody will come back in and say, I've been serving on the board of this housing organization, and here's what they're worrying about. And it's an immediacy that we might not have otherwise. So we view that as a real win-win. It encourages people to go out and expand their skill set, to be closer to the community, and we get the benefit of all that. And people love it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm hearing like, you're listening, right? Asking better questions
Right,
and being great listeners and
right.
actually baking listening in as a mutually beneficial service, right? You
Exactly.
listen and you get to help the community, but the value of just being there and listening helps you, develop better
Absolutely.
build
Yeah.
better services. I'm wondering, do you have any kind of tried and true methods as you build community, engage with communities? I'm sure you have like a lot of community group meetings, listenings. Do you have ways that you like to start meetings or kind of frameworks you like to use that help create those vibrant, safe spaces where people really know what's going?
So what we have are governing boards and advisory boards. And we don't have a particular, approach to that, as much as to say that we really try and create an environment in which people feel comfortable sharing their truth and their views, right? And I think that particularly, now that so much has moved to virtual, it's often hard to get people to talk, right? If you're in person, people feel more encouraged. When they're on a screen, they sometimes sit there silently. And so you really, really, really have to try to create an environment in which people understand that their perspectives are important and that we really want to hear them. And so I wouldn't say we have a particular plan for that, but that's the goal. And so if you know that that's the goal, then you know really what you're supposed to be doing in terms of the meeting.
Yeah, yeah. I I'm just gonna probe into that a little more because I sense there's some extra knowledge in there. When you think about setting up a meeting, like what are you looking for? What are you thinking about when you're thinking about like where is it? Is it going to be in person? Is it going to be on Zoom? How many people? What are some of the questions that you're asking yourself and thinking about?
Sure. So we actually, because we're lenders, not organizers, we don't tend to do a lot of just sort of community-based meetings. We're often present at those meetings if the city is operating or somebody from the community is operating. Our meetings tend more to be about the transactions in which we're about to engage. Are we really going to do a loan to create 100 units of housing, or what's happening in the healthcare world? And can we, as a risk matter, invest in community health centers, things like that. So we want to be sure we have the right people at the table, meaning decision makers, but also people who are impacted by whatever the set of decisions are. But we then really have to keep organizational interests at heart, right? I mean, a lot of times what you get is people who say, we need X, and they absolutely do, right? And it may or may not be something we can provide. We're not a granting organization. We don't have grants for folks. And I completely understand that that's often what the need is. And sometimes we can help connect people to those. But we have to be really clear about what our tools are and really clear in explaining to people what our tools are as well. And, it's funny. I think back to my very early days as an attorney. In addition to my commercial real estate finance and development practice, it was then Hale and Dorr, which then became Wilmer Hale, had a very active pro bono practice. And so we would be out figuring out how to finance affordable housing primarily and working with lots of community development corporations and so forth. And what I remember so strongly is we'd get the thing done and it'd be some wildly complex undertaking. And I'd go out to look at the housing, and the housing was great. And I would come back and think, but it's not healthcare and it doesn't include food, and where are the schools? And I understood in that setting and in that transaction, I had done everything we could do, but I always walked away with a sense that that wasn't in the end enough for a healthy community. And so I think I took that with me as I shifted really over into the nonprofit sector to really try and understand what is it that allows people to thrive? What is it that allows kids to really build a full life. I grew up in a working class community, right? I went to public schools. These are not issues that are foreign to me in the slightest. I know how important teachers are. I know how important neighbors are and how important communities are. And so we think a lot about that, right? About what are we doing and then what else needs doing? And is there some way that we can be the intermediary or the glue or the connector so that more of those things happen? And that's true in my personal life too, in terms of how I spend my non-Blue Hub time, but nonetheless philanthropic time.
Yeah, so many like more great questions that you asked for folks to think about, which is just such a rich way of thinking. As we're coming up on time, I want to ask you one of my favorite questions. And just thinking about your role as a nonprofit CEO and all those different domains you need to touch, which, is there, what is the one domain kind of that you touch as a CEO of a nonprofit that you feel like if you really get that dialed in, all the other domains become a little bit easier or not as necessary to deal with?
Well, that's a tough question because I think a lot of them are necessary. But I guess what I would say is we talk a lot, and I talk a lot about the need to look around the corner, right? That if you can't take a step back and look down the road and figure out both benefit and burden from what's coming, then no matter what you do in the day to day, you're going to fall off the cliff. I'll give you an example. We now, it's better than a year ago, could be a year and a half ago. I was sort of looking out at the world thinking, AI is coming and we don't know anything about it. And nobody in our sector, as far as I can tell, knows anything about it. And that cannot be. And so we launched into an entire approach. We now have our first chief information officer. We actually have our own internal AI thing. We call it Blue. And so it's protected from the public and the outside internet and so forth. But we've been feeding tons and tons of information into it so that we can do a very different sort of analysis. We can look at transactions from the past and say what worked and what didn't work. And then what we've also really focused on, AI is great sometimes. Sometimes I think of it as an idiot savant, but you really have to be careful. And so the other two questions that come to mind are how do you teach people to use it effectively? And how do you assure 100% review, right? That you cannot simply give over to it. What you can do is use it as a tool. But so it's been this long process over the course of the last year. Does it help us today? Yes. Is it critical today? No. Will it be critical tomorrow? Absolutely. And so the whole issue of really trying to look into the future and try to figure out where things are likely to go and figure out how to plan for it and how to reduce risk for it and how to be sure as an organization we're set up for it. And then frankly, how to share the information, not the content, but the approach that we've developed with other organizations is key. So our chief information officer, was out speaking at a conference in October and really trying to explain how to do all this. And I just think that's key. We don't exist in a vacuum. We exist as part of a collaborative world. And just as I see travel, it's all the same thing. It's a seamless web. But that's a lot of what we focus on. So if you really said to me, if I could only do one thing, it really is look around the corner and try and figure out how we need to tee up for what's coming.
Yeah, I always get great answers to that question, but yours really warms my heart because I often feel like the CEO's most important job is to be thinking about that future direction. What is next? What is around the corner? And unfortunately, I think too many nonprofit leaders, CEOs don't get to spend enough time doing that. And they don't, the culture doesn't recognize in the nonprofit space the value, like you actually mentioned early, the value of sitting and thinking or walking around and thinking, right? Just having the thinking, seeing time, because that's how you see around those corners. And I so wholeheartedly, you talked about like if you don't do that, you'll fall off the cliff. I like to think about it as like we're always looking for these issues, and issues are little seeds in my mind that if we find them soon, we can nurture them into opportunities. And if we don't find them or ignore them, they'll come up and whoop us in the face as a big old, problem or change.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. So I really feel that. Well, for folks listening and just appreciating everything you have shared, what is the best way for people to reach out or follow along with your work?
Well, thanks so much. And again, I really, really appreciate your work in this field and to all of my sister and brother CEOs out there and good luck to all of us.
As we wrap up, my last question that I want to add in here is because being a CEO can feel like a lonely role. And I think for smaller organizations, there are a lot of resources for newer nonprofits and smaller organizations. But I find that as you get larger, sometimes the support isn't always there. What are your resources? Where do you turn for support as a CEO?
Sure. Well, I think I'd say first that I view part of my obligation as a CEO of an established organization is to provide some of that support to newer CEOs, and I do all the time. But the other thing is, there are a number of folks around town that we all kind of serve as each other's kitchen cabinet. And it's not the same kind of organization. They're all nonprofits of one sort or another. But I'll get a call or I'll give a call with someone who says, I'm struggling with this, or I say I'm struggling with that. And we all are, I think, incredibly generous with each other. Those calls never go unreturned. And I rely on them a lot, right? Because sometimes you just really need to test your own thinking against somebody with equivalent experience, not the same content experience, but the kind of experience that comes with being senior in leading organizations. They can be personnel problems or finance problems or political problems or community issues. It's all that stuff, right? And so we do that for each other. And there are 4 or 5 women actually around town and I that, we just go back and forth as we need to. And we always return those calls instantly. Mine are returned, theirs are returned. And it's tremendously, tremendously valuable.
Yeah, I love that. A local informal mastermind of sorts.
Yep, exactly.
So
Exactly.
I love it. And I love the women supporting women too. There are a lot of women in the nonprofit leadership space, but still, at the larger organization levels, actually women are again the minority, even as CEOs. So that's an area of work that needs to be done as well.
For
Well,
sure.
Elyse, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you out there for listening and everything you do to make our communities better. A favor I have to ask of everyone listening is if you could take a moment to rate and review this podcast so it helps the algorithm deliver it to other folks who would benefit from it, or share this episode or another episode with a colleague who you think could benefit. Create your own mastermind of sorts. Until next time, I wish you all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.